All right, hello and welcome everybody to another episode of The Big Three on CPA TV. My name is Mihir Torsekar, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host and fellow economist at CPA, Andrew Rechenberg, and we're here to talk to you all about the big three topics happening in trade this week. But before we get to the main show, we wanted to talk to you up front about what those big three topics are going to be and give you a preview of what those items are. So first off, we are going to talk a little bit about the implications of Ambassador Greer, his recent statements about Chinese coercive tactics against companies investing in the U.S., particularly in the shipbuilding industry, and as well as other critical industries. Andrew, go ahead with the next two items.
Yeah, the second item is that CPA recently submitted comments for the medical devices Section 232 investigation. This investigation covers a lot of different topics and trade products that are coming in for medical devices, everything from syringes to gloves. And these are all big products that we really saw shortages during COVID. And even though there are a lot of basic equipments like gloves or syringes, things that are relatively cheap to manufacture, these have been completely wiped out for U.S. domestic production. And when we have an event like COVID happens, countries like China or India, they cut off their supply because they have their own populations, and we're left with shortages. And just basic things like medical gloves that you would need for surgery or for manufacturing pharmaceuticals, all of these are now in shortages because we've hollowed out our whole industry. And so CPA has taken a product-by-product specific approach based on the market dynamics and the trade picture for each of these different products. And we've made concrete representations and recommendations for what these products need for them to be reshored here in the U.S. and for us to revive our domestic industry. And then for the third topic, we're going to talk about there's a recent trade case for the Department of Justice going after trade fraud indictments. This is going to be a large approach that the U.S. government is taking, really cracking down on trade enforcement, because these are products that have really hollowed out our tariff policy. The lack of enforcement has brought the effective tariff rate down since 2018 for a lot of different products, and unless we change our enforcement, it's going to really harm our trade policy moving forward. And so we've brought on an expert in this field, David Rashid, who's been leading an effort on trade enforcement and what the United States can do to really get caught up in this space.
Fantastic. All right, so let's get to it. Okay, so up front, Ambassador Greer, he's been in the news lately about some of the comments that he's made, particularly on the heels of China's latest sort of coercive tactics that they've used. They've kind of weaponized their dominance over rare earth magnets against the United States. We talked a little bit about it in last week's podcast, or I should say last week's Big Three episode. So, in particular, he framed it as sort of economic coercion against companies who are investing in American, shipbuilding and other critical industries. Andrew, what do you think about the broader implications? What do you think this is signaling from the U.S.'s standpoint?
I think that this is the next step in the China-U.S. trade war, and this is just an escalation from a lot of the measures that we've already been seeing, whether it's export controls for rare earth elements, or any of the measures that China's taking so far. And really what China is, this really reveals that China is scared. We are threatening the exact heart of their industrial base, which is their export sector. They rely heavily on exports for their entire economy. And as the world's biggest market, we are their biggest customer. And so this tariff move for the U.S. to reshore an industry is a direct economic threat to them. And I think these coercive actions against companies who are investing in the U.S., investing in U.S. production, shows that China's going to pull out all the stops. They're going to go out kicking and screaming for not allowing U.S. reindustrialization to take place because it directly harms their economic position. And so I think that this shows that China does really heavily rely on this export sector. We have a strong hand in this trade negotiation because of that reliance. But we also need to be wary of these things. That's why I think the statement by Ambassador Greer is so critical, that we need to be aware of this coercion that China is doing, and we need to take action to protect companies and actually reward companies that are willing to invest long-term here in the United States and make our domestic supply chain and our industrial base more resilient.
Yeah, I think if you look at some of the policies that have been issued by, a lot of foreign countries, they're actually rising up against Chinese overcapacity, and they're frankly following our lead when it comes to identifying the effects, the consequences of Chinese overproduction. I mean, frankly, they're just not consuming any of what they're producing, and they expect the world to be their dumping ground. Now that they don't have the US to rely on anymore because we're tightening that loophole down, they're looking to export across the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is rising up with a record number of trade actions against China. And I think we've actually been. I think Ambassador Greer has also been directly saying that he wants more 232 style policy interventions that other countries are imposing. And you're seeing the EU, steel producers, aluminum producers are all kind of essentially clamoring for that same kind of relief. So I do think we've been really leading on this issue. Look forward to seeing how that gets resolved. So the second item on our agenda is to talk about some of the CPA comments that we just filed last Friday for the medical goods. Why don't you talk a little bit about our approach to that? I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, so at CPA, we are looking at a product by product approach, looking at each one of these individual products on its own and really recommending a personalized recommendation for each one of these products, not just a sector-wide ad valorem tariff at X%. And I think that it's essential because all of these products have different market dynamics, they have different U.S. production levels, and they have different needs for where the demand is in the U.S. and how urgent it is. And so for taking example, medical gloves. For medical gloves, we are 99% dependent on foreign supply for medical gloves. And one of the big vulnerabilities that we saw with this is during COVID, when a lot of our medical glove supply was cut off. And China actually engaged in a policy of hoarding medical gloves. They went on a global purchasing campaign to hoard all of the medical glove supply for their own population, and it jacked up the price of medical gloves. And when they stopped exporting to the US, we were left with nothing. We had to improvise. But because of this, we did learn some lessons at first. We invested heavily in trying to make domestic producers for these medical gloves. And at first, it was a great success. But as soon as COVID ended and the supply from China came roaring back in, the prices collapsed and our domestic producers had been left out to hang, even though we made this great initial investment in a stable U.S. production. And so because of all this, we need to have a stable tariff policy going forward to correct for the subsidized China pricing. And it's not just China. In fact, in 2025, most of our imports actually come from Malaysia. But in the end, it's all tied back to China due to the rubber feedstock that is used to make all these gloves. China still controls that base feedstock supply. And so they control the worldwide pricing, and their supply and even their investment in their companies have gone to Malaysia to try to get away from any U.S. duties. And so in the end, we're all still reliant on China. And that's why we recommend a high specific tariff rate for things like gloves in order to reshore that U.S. production alongside federal purchasing agreements and procurement that favors U.S. made production to give that demand signal and that market space for U.S. producers and make sure our medical devices are made here at home and we have a stable supply.
I think our 232 process has really given us an opportunity to try to execute our vision of moving more towards a managed trade approach as opposed to simply just saying, oh, we're going to slap a 50% ad valorem tariff on this broad category of goods or sectors. We're able to get really granular about the kind of relief that is to be administered and that's going to be effective. And again, these 232s and the comments that we've submitted across the board have really given us a chance to identify what are the specific issues. And we've really laid out, you and me and in the work that we've done in Chuck as well, just talking about some of the main issues as far as what the data says, the industrial competitiveness issues that we're able to lay out in these reports that we put together. So I think it's moving the ball forward. I think we're moving in the right direction on this issue as well. And I love the idea, the point that you make too about, a lot of times we think about, this high value added, the high value, the high tech stuff that we, specialize in. That's what we need to focus on and just, give away the low, the textiles, the low cost or low value added products. And then the pandemic comes around, and we see that our economy is brought to a halt because we can't obtain, relatively inexpensive commodified items like gloves or there's even the syringes, which are of relatively low value compared to, the MRI machines, the CT scanners, that, the high-tech med tech equipment that we specialize in producing. It's all very important, to the entire healthcare system, to the entire economy. And I think that these 232s have given us an opportunity to really make that case. So, really looking forward to kind of seeing the kind of relief that we end up getting from those investigations. So we'll just have to see how that goes. All right, so for our third topic of the day, we are here to talk to our special guest, David Rashid, Executive Chairman of Plews and Edelmann, about a recent industry alliance for trade enforcement now, an alliance that was formed by members of the Coalition for a Prosperous America. We want to talk to him about his experience in working with that group and some of the initiatives that he's trying to push forward with some of the work that they're doing. In particular, I think it was launched in 2018, and they note something like $194 billion in government revenue that's been lost through transshipment and false labeling and shell importing. So, Dave, I wanted to kick it over to you. Maybe talk to us a little bit about your role on this committee, or this, I should say, this alliance, this partnership, and some of the goals that you have moving forward.
Sure. So there are 6 founding members, and as you mentioned, they're CPA members, and we come from different industries. So from kitchen cabinets to iron foundry to auto parts, and among others, and a 3PL actually, and that's a very interesting story. But we all came together because we see the impact of trade crime on our businesses and on our industries. And we've all tried to pursue ways to get the laws enforced, and we've all struggled to succeed. And so we've come together to raise awareness of this issue. We launched this initiative a couple weeks ago formally, although we've been working informally together for quite a while. And we feel it's an existential issue for our businesses, and we think it's very important to the country, therefore, as well, because we're just representative of the population at large. So that's what we're up to, raising awareness, and we have a platform for change.
Yeah, I think it's so important that, going back to 2018, I remember I've read your story, and by the way, I'll mention that your stories, but your personal experience with your company and the challenges you've faced since the 2018 period when these tariffs first started coming online. There was a lot of hope. I think I remember hearing about the optimism you had about how finally there was going to be some relief for your business, and how that quickly became a real struggle because of these evasions. And you saw firsthand how companies in China are able to avoid, playing the shell game. If you could talk a little bit about maybe your experience, I guess,
Sure.
so we can make it concrete.
So, no, absolutely. So, I have a long background in automotive manufacturing, and part manufacturing. And the product that Plews and Edelmann makes today, I have global experience manufacturing. And so I was struggling to understand how we could be underpriced so much back in 2018. And so when the tariffs came in, I was very grateful that we would have a chance to perhaps compete. But what I realized was that my competitors' pricing didn't change after the tariffs were implemented, even though my competitor was based in China and shipping products into their subsidiary in the U.S. And so that got me curious, and I ran an investigation. And what we realized was that, and we were able to collect perfect evidence. I mean, like shipping documents from China to Thailand, documents from Thailand to the United States. We were able to collect financial statements from the 2 companies they were using in Thailand to move the product through Thailand. I thought in 2021, when we took it to the Department of Justice and we filed the False Claims Act, that we would, one, get a penalty applied to the company for cheating, and 2, they would be forced to play by the rules. But neither of those things happened. 6 months later, the DOJ told us that they would not intervene um, on our behalf, and our lawyers suggested that we don't pursue a False Claims Act. And so I was told to then submit an allegation. And what I had been told by people who had used that tool, which is a tool offered by CBP, is that not only do you not hear anything, but you don't see the impact of that of the use of that tool. So therefore, I was very hungry for another solution. I found a group called the Trade Fraud Task Force. We worked together. They were out of the commercial litigation branch of the DOJ. That got stalled out. I went to Washington. I sought support through my congressman, Darren LaHood. He introduced me to the select committee. They invited me to speak about our situation. The select committee understood well the evidence, and they advocated on our behalf. Our competitor was raided in 2024 January by DHS, but they continue to operate today in the U.S. The investigation is ongoing, and so there are 5 other members in our group, and each have a unique story, but the result is the same. They've gotten some traction, but not enough to make a difference, really.
Andrew, did you want to go ahead and jump in? And no, you probably have some thoughts as well.
Yeah, this unfortunately reminds me of a lot of what we're seeing for a lot of different sectors. And as you mentioned, the group has a lot of different members, and unfortunately, they all have the same experiences. And it really reminds me of what happened to the steel industry, that the steel industry got a lot of tariff relief in 2018. But what we've seen from a lot of our reports is that the actual effective tariff rate, the amount of tariff duty that's being actually paid per value that's coming into the country, has dropped drastically since 2018, since by about 70-80% of that being lost to circumvention or carve-outs or any of these different issues. And so it's really neutered a lot of that tariff policy that on paper you seem to have relief from. And so I was wondering, what do you think is needed specifically to get this tariff enforcement policy caught up with the actual tariff policy themselves? And what do we need to do to fill this gap?
Yeah. So, one of the things that we've committed to is bring a constructive voice to the conversation, right? I think finger pointing only creates, negative environment where people are less willing to be open and thoughtful about the real issues here. So, it's with a constructive hat on that we advocate for a 5-point plan. And really, we asked ourselves, do we want to come up with new ideas, or are there already ideas out there, whether they be laws or otherwise, that we can grab onto and say, hey, look, let's just implement these first. I think the road is very long, and there will always be a degree of circumvention. But the question is, can we do better? And what are some foundational steps? And so the first thing is we looked at, I think it's the Office for the Inspector General. There was an audit report that came out in 2024 that was quite critical of how CBP managed the complaints and how they followed up on tariff collections. And so what we think first is we need to measure outcomes, right? There's a lot of reporting of how many things are filed, right? How many cases have been filed. But there isn't much around, out of the 7,000 allegations that have been filed since 2022, how many have actually resulted in fines collected or people criminally charged. False Claims Act, it's the same thing. There's some reporting, but nothing related to trade crime. So one is we need objective outcome reporting, because then that will elevate the awareness that there isn't really an effective enforcement regime today. Mm-hmm. Then there's legislation that's been put out there, Fighting the Trade Cheats Act, the Manifest Modernization Act, and there is the Protecting American Industry and Labor Act. All of these 3 laws have been introduced. They're all extremely constructive first steps to create a better enforcement regime. And so we are very supportive of those laws. And then finally, the non-resident importer authorization is very bothersome because what it means is, even if you're caught, there's no accountability there because you don't have to be a resident of this country in order to be able to import into this country. And therefore, there's no accountability. And there are just, I think, a handful of countries that have this kind of similar authorization, and it doesn't make sense.
When you talk about just the different avenues that you've been able to identify as far as, whether there's legislative solutions or whether there's task force or, just various enforcement protocols that are in place, like, is the issue that there's a lack of coordination, like folks aren't talking to each other, or is it a lack of resources, a lack of priority? What do you think? I mean, is it any one of those or all some combination of it all?
Yeah, it's certainly a combination of it all. My trade attorney used to work on the trade fraud task force, and he was interviewed by NPR last year, and his comment was, it's not well organized, it's not well orchestrated. All of these different agencies play different roles, and there's a lot of overlap and fiefdoms, and people try to stay out of each other's way. And I think, it's time that we reassess how the roles and responsibilities are organized across the different agencies, and we reset. And I think that's what those outcome metrics will show, because if people feel like enforcement is working, then there's nothing to fix. And so that's why we really emphasize, measure the outcomes. Let's understand the outcomes, because that's going to tell us that it's not working. There aren't any meaningful outcomes at this stage.
hmm Andrew, did you have any other thoughts you wanted to weigh in on, or any questions,
Yeah,
I should say?
I think the last question I had is just looking forward on this issue. Do you think that we can get to a point where we have just good enforcement, that we have a good system that can catch a lot of this trade fraud coming in? Or do you view this as more of an ongoing battle, that as tariffs are put in place or as enforcement measures are put in place, these different importers or foreign companies will still keep finding new ways to evade tariffs? Is this more of a constant battle, or do you think we can get to a point where we just have a solid enforcement system that might not need to be updated?
Yeah, I think we'll always have some degree of cheating. Like in any system, you'll always have people who are willing to break the rules. But I think there's so much more we can do to improve it, right? There's this whole concept of strategic enforcement where if you send a clear message, right, to certain industries, right, that there is going to be there's a new sheriff in town, right, that people will be prosecuted. People will think twice. I mean, what I like about the PALE Act is that it puts the trade crime unit into the criminal division of the DOJ. And that primary tool is jail time.
Mm.
So if you think about it from that perspective, the risk to being caught becomes much higher, because today, you might get penalized 10 years later, and it will be at a fraction of the original penalty. And so people just accept it as the risk of doing business. But if people know that the consequences can be immediate and that they could suffer the ultimate price, which is the loss of freedom, then I think the game changes.
Yeah, I think that this comes around at such an opportune time, really, because again, the president's agenda is very much focused on tariffs as a policy for to achieve a variety of different ends. And of course, we know that those tariffs are only going to be as effective as our ability to enforce that. And I think your story with your company, but as well as like this alliance that's been brought together, really highlights that. And maybe I think it can definitely get on the administration's agenda, because if people see, oh, well, you got the statutory tariff figure in place, why isn't it translating into any benefits? People are going to start to wonder. It's going to almost undermine the efficacy of the policy. And so I think what this alliance is really doing is really raising something, a concern that's just so important, and I think so important to the overall success of that policy. So really, really great to hear the work you're doing. Is there any kind of overarching thought, maybe concluding thought that you might have, that you want to leave our viewers with when it comes to the kind of work that the Alliance is doing, and what you all hope to achieve?
Well, I encourage viewers to go to the website because it is intended to be a one-stop shop for information as it relates to trade crime and the enforcement mechanisms in place and their record to date. It has our recommendations and it has a living petition, which allows companies to sign up. We started with the 6 founding members just over 2 weeks ago. Now we have 35 companies who have signed up, who are willing to speak out and say, yes, we need better trade enforcement. And this is really encouraging. We didn't expect to be able to sign up this many companies this quickly. And it's now, these are companies that initially you reach out to your friends who have been impacted and so forth. But now, companies are coming out of the woodwork, and I'm reading the stories of each of these companies to better understand. And it's amazing. It's a cross section of American business, and I'm very encouraged by the fact that people are willing to speak out and sign this petition. So that's what I would ask people to do.
Great. And that website, enforcementnow.com, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, perfect. Well, Dave, thank you so much for your time. And I think that's all I have for today. Andrew, if you had any other thoughts, I'll give you a second to see if you.
Yeah, I just wanted to again thank Dave for coming on. I think this is such a crucial issue. It goes hand in hand with all the tariff policy that's coming in place, that if we don't have this enforcement right alongside it, then a lot of that tariff policy can lose its real value. And so just thank you again for bringing all of our attention to this issue, and thank you for all the critical work there.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Dave and Andrew. And we'll see you again next week when we talk about the next big 3 items happening in trade. So stay tuned. See you then.
Bye.